Hi, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about socialization. We're up to chapter 4. So, of course, like other classes, I'll provide this narrated discussion here for you. So, we're going to be looking at our first topic, of course, which is overall socialization. And socialization is really the process where you learn how to act and behave and believe the norms and the societies and the cultures in which you grow up. So, socialization is really the process of becoming a member of that society, the process of becoming a member of that culture to internalize the values, beliefs, ideas, social norms of that society and to fit in as a whole member of that society. Now, socialization doesn't just happen when we're young, it doesn't just happen when we're children. We continue to be socialized, we continue to go through the socialization process throughout our life, especially when we encounter new environments, when we encounter new situations. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the lecture today. Now, sociology does not say that biology has no effect. It definitely does not say that at all. However, what it does say is that socialization or nurture really cannot be understood apart from nature. And then nature or our biological selves really cannot be understood apart from the socialization process, the nurturing process. So, nature versus nurture is a false choice, it's a false dichotomy. Sociologists would say that nurture is our nature because without proper socialization and without proper nurture, we can never fully develop as human beings. And you can see this is visible in people who are never fully and are never properly socialized. They can never really be fully human in the sense of being able to be integrated into the societies around them. There is a lot of new research done on how plastic our brains are, that we have substantial neuroplasticity, and the brain changes with experience. The brain changes with our environment. And if we grow up in an environment in where there's not proper nurture, where there's not proper care, where there's a lot of abuse, neglect, abandonment, these children will never have normal lives when they become older and into adolescence and adulthood. They are much more likely to have lower IQs. Their language is impaired, brain function is impaired, memory is impaired. They're more likely to suffer from hyperarousal. They're more likely to have problems with impulse control and with anger. And it's because um, especially their first few years of life, lacked that uh, guidance and nurture that is required to develop uh, normal socialization processes and to be able to express feelings and emotions in a healthy way. So again, the brain is very it has a lot of neuroplasticity. It changes with the environment. It's not like a computer chip that is static. Um, a computer chip, of course, can read one language, that computer language that it was programmed to understand. The human mind is hypothetically programmed to speak, you know, thousands of different languages, from Chinese to Arabic to English. It's whatever is exposed to us. Our brain is able to then take that information and process it and learn from that. Or if we don't have proper socialization, the brain doesn't function that way. Okay, so it's a lot more complicated than most people realize. Um, and the fight between is it nurture or is it nature, again, is a false fight. It's a false argument, a false choice. Charles Horton Cooley is a very important sociologist who talked about how the self develops. And again, the self does not develop without human interaction. And he also discussed this concept called the looking glass self. And the looking glass self is this idea that so much of our self construct, our self image, our conception of who we are is dependent upon how we think other people view us. And so it's not at all apart from our social interaction with others. And it's all based upon our social environment um, that we are exposed to. The self cannot develop without that social environment around us. Mead also talked about the difference between um, the cognitive stages, the cognitive and social stages that children go through. Um, Mead would say that the first stage would be called the I. Okay, and if you've taken care of infants before and very young children, you probably you probably have seen this. Um, Dalton Conley has a very good explanation of this in the book, this difference between the I and the me. So the I is the first stage. The I is the stage of development in which infants are aware of themselves. Obviously, they're conscious of themselves, but not how they relate to other people and not how they are perceived by others. So infants can perceive themselves, but they really can't perceive how other people perceive them. Okay, so Dalton Conley again has a good example of this. That when an infant closes her eyes, she can't see her mom, but she doesn't realize that her mom can still see her. Okay, so she doesn't have this sense of a sense of anything outside of herself and how that may interact with her. The me stage is the stage in which the girl, after she's a little bit older, is aware of herself as seen by others. She's aware that her mom can still see her when she closes her eyes, when the infant closes her eyes. Okay, so the me stage is also very similar to what Mead called the play stage. The play stage is an early stage in the socialization process whereby we learn by doing. We learn by mimicking what we see other people doing. You, again, I'm sure, remember this from your own childhood, or if you have been a babysitter or have just interacted with children between the ages of, say, 3 to 6, they love to copy everything that the adults do. That's why they love, to play kitchens. They love to play house. They love to, have this fantasy play. Uh, they love to pretend that they're doing something that is real. And this is a very important stage in the socialization process, this imaginative play where they're mimicking other people. So again, um, say they have a play kitchen set and they're mimicking, they're making an egg, right? They're making an egg on their play kitchen set, but obviously they don't know how to make an egg. They're just playing that part that they see their mom or their dad doing. Um, Kids in the play stage also really they like to play with balls. They might like to play baseball, but they don't understand the rules and the order yet. So if they're in a t-ball game, for instance, with other 5-year-olds, even if they do manage to hit the ball off the tee, one of the first things that they'll do is just start jumping up and down, right? They're happy to have, just that play. They don't know that they necessarily will have to run to first base, okay? But by the game stage, which is the second stage in the socialization process, they know the rules, they know the order, they know how the team operates, they know their position in relationship to the whole. And the same goes for making an egg by the game stage, which occurs probably around the age of 6, 7, 8, 6 to 8. They understand again, kind of the rules, the order. They may actually understand now how you can cook an egg on the stove, or they might understand how the ingredients work together in a recipe for cake. Okay, so that's a higher stage in the socialization process. That's the play stage. I'm sorry, that's the game. That's the game stage. And then with the generalized other, that is the final stage in the socialization process. And with the generalized other, this is when you become aware of the broader and more abstract meanings involved in interaction. So let's go back to the example of kitchen and cooking. By the generalized other stage, which is around, like 8, 9, 10, that age range, kids may finally understand, oh, why is it that mom is always in the kitchen? And not dad? Why is mom doing the cooking, the cleaning, but not dad? And that's when they start to question these broader societal kind of quote unquote unofficial rules like gender norms. Okay, with the baseball example, kids in the generalized other stage would have an understanding now of, well, maybe if you're good at baseball, you'll be a popular kid. It seems to be the athletic students are the popular students at the school. And why is that? Okay, so they're able to internalize these broader abstract meanings of society given to them. Okay, so this next slide just goes through what we just talked about: imitation, play, game, and generalized other. The different stages in the process of socialization and acculturation. Okay, we're going to skip Erickson. Erickson was much more of a psychologist. You can read about that in the book. It's interesting, but for today, just to save a little bit of time, we'll skip that. You can also read this, Pascoe's interview, where it talks about how boys especially communicate and interact with other boys that they deem didn't do a masculine performance or weren't acting in a masculine enough way. Um, and so they're sort of held to uh, these standards that are developed at a very early age. Children pick up gender norms at a very, very early age, which we'll talk more about that when we get to the gender unit. So there are also, of course, agents of socialization. These are the uh, the institutions of our culture that impact us, that help us and assist us in the socialization process. And it may be in good or bad, but these are institutions that assist in acculturating us and socializing us. And of course, families. The family is the most basic institution in society, and that has a primary role. And so we're going to talk about family much more later, as also later in the semester. Um, we're also going to be talking about schools and peers, of course, later in the semester. We've already talked a lot about the media, especially last time when we looked at culture. I'm also going to talk about total institutions. So a total institution is a place where resocialization takes place. It's a place where your previous identity is reshaped into a new identity. So you can think of total institutions as perhaps a prison, military boot camp, or perhaps a boarding school, and that really it changes how you it changes your identity. Okay, so you're no longer Paul, you are a prisoner. You're no longer Joey, you're a soldier. Okay, um, the total institutions, for example, would control when you wake up, when you go to bed, when you eat, when you sleep, when you do your activities, your appearance, your haircut, what you wear, how you dress, right? So it in a total institution, your previous identity is sort of, if not erased, because you can never erase that, but it's superseded by your new identity. I mean, that's reason why in the military, especially for men, their heads are shaved. It's not that you can't shoot a gun with long hair. It's that um, you are no longer just Paul, or you're no longer just Maria. You're now a soldier, and you're to act like that. And of course, that is how. Then that is the way. The reason why you wear a uniform as well. Your personal identity is subsumed, and this new identity as a soldier is advanced. Okay, and again, other examples would be prisons, boarding schools, and you can maybe think of some other examples. Um, as far as school, teachers have a very strong influence in how children are socialized. This has a very strong impact, very powerful impact. Um, Lots of research that we'll get into more in the gender unit discusses how boys are treated very differently than girls by teachers as well as by classmates, but that's, again, more of the whole school experience, including peers. Um, Teachers treat students of different ethnic groups very differently. That's something that also that we'll talk about. So the school is very much not just about learning academic knowledge. It's also about conformity and control, and social control. Um, and again, many children have a hard time in formal school. It's very artificial, right, for students to sit still all day and to concentrate just on one task all day. But it is a type of socialization into the economy and how people are supposed to interact with each other in the wider economy. School is training them for that. It's also training them to think of themselves as citizens of the United States, and if they're in America. Okay, so um, Dalton Conley talks a lot about this in the chapter. I would definitely look at that closer. All right, so we're going to look a little bit more at families with Annette LaRue. Now, you can read about this too in the chapter. Her big study was conducted about 20 years ago, and she looked at the difference between working class parenting styles and the parenting styles of sort of the upper middle class. And after observing families for a very long period, she actually immersed herself in people's homes and lived with them. This was a form of participant observation. She began to see stark contrast between the parenting styles of working class families and the parenting styles of middle class and upper middle class families. She called the upper middle class families parenting style concerted cultivation, and the parenting style of the working class she called natural growth. And again, she talks much more about this in the book. It also deals with discipline, very different disciplinary styles between the upper middle class and the working class. I'll have you read about that, though, in the book. Haddad also has some interesting research out, and many other socialization scholars have also delved into this issue of how much we are medicating children, and teenagers and children in the United States consume the majority of pharmaceutical drugs worldwide, even though we are only 4% of the world population. We consume more than half of all pharmaceuticals in the world. And this includes things like Ritalin, drugs that are also that modify mood and behavior. Okay, I'll have you just read that part. He explains that very well in the book. But again, um, because of this notion of kind of control and conformity in schools, we try to treat the individual student to get them to conform to the school's rules rather than reimagining how school might be in a more independent and self-directed, um, if it was more independent and self-directed, if it was designed that way, more for how children actually are, how they actually are when they're very young, and including into adolescence. So I'll have you read that because, again, Dalton Conley has a very good explanation of that. Okay, so we just have a few other items here to talk about. Robert Merton discusses this concept of different statuses and different roles in his role theory. So let's talk about status and roles. So a status is any position that you occupy, okay? A status is a position in society that you occupy that comes with a set of expectations. So think about all the statuses that you occupy. It might be a student, it might be a nurse, it might be a brother, it might be a husband, it might be a mother, it might be a wife, it might be a doctor, it might be an uncle, it might be a grandparent, right? It might be that you're handicapped, or that you have HIV, or that or you're a cancer survivor. Okay, any of these things are statuses that come with a set of expectations. Okay, so an ascribed status is a status that you're born into, and that is unlikely to change. So ascribed status could be your gender, it could be a religion, it could be what what sibling, like if you have siblings or not, sibling order. So it could also be if you're like born again with a medical condition that impacts your life in a dramatic way. So that is something that you are born with, and or that is very unlikely to change. An achieved status is one that we've earned through individual effort, or that is imposed by others. So an achieved status can be that you're married, like husband, wife. Achieved status could be a college graduate, or a doctor, or any type of profession, teacher. That is an ascribed status, and often, I'm sorry, that is an achieved status, and often I meant to say our ascribed statuses can impact, of course, our achieved statuses. So, for example, my sister, she's a woman, and she is a pastor. She's a reverend in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. And as a woman, she was sort of, because she has always kind of wanted to be a pastor, she was lucky that she was born into a Christian denomination that allowed women to become priests or pastors. Had she been born Catholic, she wouldn't have been able to remain a Catholic and be a priest, right? She, the Catholic Church does not allow women to be priests. It does not allow the ordination of women. So that, is an example of how an ascribed status, can really impact your achieved status. Okay, so I hope that's a good example. Let me give you just another example of that. So, okay, I was born a boy, and I identify as a boy or as a man. And I grew up on a farm that was passed down by, into different generations. So my great grandfather farmed, the grandfather farmed, and my dad farmed. And so farming, of course, in the US, it tends to occupy a very male world. We don't tend to think of women as farmers for some reason. We tend to think of as men as the farmers, even though worldwide it actually tends to be women who are more likely to farm, especially in Africa. So I was the boy, in the family, and so it was my role to take over the farm. That's what I was sort of um, socialized to do. My dad really wanted me to do that. My grandfather really wanted me to do that. Other family members did, but I never wanted to do that. I sort of felt forced into that, and I didn't take over the farm, and that caused a lot of tension with my dad. So, and with other, in other aspects of my life. So, my scribe status as a boy, growing up, um, it was just expected that I'd become a farmer, or that my chief status would be a farmer. My sister actually enjoyed farming more than I did, and botany and plants and all of that. But she was never expected to take over the farm. And again, the gender norms here are coming into very importance. Okay, so I hope that helps. I hope that helps delineate those two different types of statuses. And then a master status is a status that kind of overwhelms all the others. Okay, so being on losing your job, for many people that can become an overwhelming status. Unfortunately, that takes precedent over anything else and kind of consumes their life. It may impact their marriage. It could impact their emotional state, of course. It could obviously impact their children, their economic status. So being unemployed can become a master status. Perhaps a veteran, that can become a master status, especially if you have fought overseas. Um, Being handicapped, of course, can become a master status, or having a chronic medical condition, right? So that is a condition that can be either ascribed or achieved. Okay. And now, when Merton discussed rules, these are the behaviors expected from a particular status. So again, I was the boy in the family. I was supposed to inherit the farm. It was my role to help my dad on the farm starting when I was, like 11 or 12. And every year I was expected to do more to help with the family farm, the family business. My sister never was, because she was a girl, it wasn't perceived by our society that girls, take over farms. It's always that the boy, the male heir, takes over the farm. And so, my sister and I had very different rules based on these status expectations that society impacted to my family, and then my family impacted to me. Often we have what are called role conflicts and role strains. So, a role conflict occurs when roles are associated with one status, when they clash. Okay, so let me give you an example of a role conflict. Okay, again, this is a conflict that occurs with roles associated with one status. Okay, a clash with roles associated with a different status. So we often see work-family conflict. That would be a very good example of role conflict. You have a role as an employee, as a worker. You have to work 40, 50, 60 hours a week at your job. This will obviously conflict or may conflict with your role as a husband, wife, spouse, father, mother, and any other type of important role that you might have in society. So a role strain occurs when roles associated with a single status. Okay, so a role strain would be roles we would be with a strain within one status. So say I'm a professor, and often as a professor, my I have different roles. I have a role to do research, and I have a role to teach. And at Methodist, my main role is to teach and not to do research, since I'm not at a big uh, public university where research is more important. So, but there still is a conflict, because if I want to do research, that's time that I'm taking away from teaching and maybe developing lesson plans, and taking time away from my students, taking time away from grading. But then if I want to, um, you know, do just teaching, I know then I can't publish anything. And then it's hard to advance in the discipline. It's hard to advance in my profession. So these are all things that people deal with on a daily basis: role conflict and role strain. Okay, I'm not going to be saying much here regarding gender roles. We're going to talk a lot more about gender when we get to that unit. But parents, relatives, teachers, coaches, religious teachers, pastors, they all treat boys very differently than they treat girls. From the moment that they are born, girls are treated differently than boys and vice versa. And I'll say a lot more about this later, but just really quickly, tons of research has shown that more nurturing is given to girls than boys. Parents tend to be much more nurturing to girls, tend to hug them more, tend to hold them more, tend to kiss them more. They're more protective of girls than they are of boys. They let boys do much riskier things than girls, even though all of the research shows that physical ability, there's no difference in physical ability between young boys and young girls, and even much later on into the teenage years. Um, they allow boys to cry much longer than girls. So again, this it's that lack of attention, lack of nurture, and this does impact how again the brain becomes wired with call and response techniques and call and response actions. So we'll talk more about this though when we discuss gender in its own separate unit. So I wanted to talk about Goffman within the social construction of reality. Um, this is something that um, can really be summarized in that if people presume and presume and assume that something is real, it becomes real in its consequences. Okay, so the book discusses this, and I'll just have you read that on your own time. I wanted to talk more about Irving Goffman's dramaturgical analysis and dramaturgical theory. It's kind of an interesting idea. Um, Goffman, who wrote in the 20th century in America, really came to this understanding and assumption that social life is really about being, um, is really almost like being on a stage. It's almost like being a theatrical performance. We're all actors on a metaphorical stage, and we all have um, costumes. We all have set of roles that and scripts and sets. Okay, so it's sort of like a metaphysical stage. So think about teaching. Think about your professor. Think about your teacher. If professors have a script, right? Especially in a regular classroom setting, the script usually is, welcome, hello, we're going to discuss this today. Open your books or read these slides. Write down, copy these slides, copy what I write down on the board. That is the script. And the script, it might be a lecture, it might be a discussion, it might be an activity. But we're engaging and we're acting on these metaphorical scripts. The costume, that might be a little bit different, but right, for me, it'd be business casual. And the set, of course, is a classroom where um, where I'm up in front and students are sitting in rows in desks. And we just assume that's the best way to do teaching. And maybe it is, and maybe it's not. But there's this assumption that teaching involves pupils sitting more passively in desks or chairs, all looking at the front of the class to the, to the teacher. So, and maybe that isn't the best way to engage in education, but that is how the um, dramaturgical production takes place. Okay, so think about that. Think about how we all sort of move through life with different sets of scripts. So I'll act and have different set of scripts. I'll act very differently and have different scripts at work than I will at home. And I'll have different set of scripts at work than I will at a restaurant with my friends, right? I'll change my behavior. I'll act differently when I'm with my friends or when I'm with my parents than when I'm with my students. So we can think of those things as different stages, right? So one set of stage is at work, another stage is with my friends, another stage in theatrical performances with my parents. Okay, so that is it for the narrated lecture for today. If you have any questions, please let me know.